Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Freedman, and our next guest is Emily Cherkin, founder of the Screentime Consultant. Welcome to Radio Entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you wouldn't mind, just start off by telling us a little bit about what the Screentime Consultant is all about and why the need, which would seem obvious, but why don't you tell us some reasons?
Yes. So I'm a former classroom teacher, and I witnessed a real change from about 2003 to 2012, 2015, in terms of what my students were experiencing at home with digital tech, but also as a classroom teacher, what was coming in for me as a teacher, what I was expected to use for technology. And I just started hearing from my students, I talked to them about social media and how you behave online. And they were like, this is all great, but it's our parents who are on their phones. It's our parents who are texting and driving. And, you're talking to us, but you need to talk to them. And I thought, aha. And so I decided to launch my business as a way of supporting parents primarily, to manage a problem, as you point out, that is something that is pretty universal in this day and age. And especially, I would say, in the last 5 years has really accelerated. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm curious, is this a function of do as I say, not as I do? Is that what your parents trying to model for
No,
their kids' behaviors
yeah,
or yeah.
exactly. No, you hit the nail on the head. I am here to help families, but it starts with parents, right? So I certainly believe that unless we're willing to change our own behavior, our kids' behavior won't change. And I don't mean I always say I'm not anti-tech. I'm tech intentional. And so it's again like a lot of other things in the world, balance, moderation, being intentional about how we use it. It's just in our face 24/7. It's really hard to avoid it even if we want to. And so I think it becomes then how do we navigate that world while keeping in mind also that children aren't small adults, that their brains are fundamentally quite different.
Hmm. So it seems to be, as you said, pervasive, and I think your window to 2015. I'd be curious as to the last 10 years, because it would seem to me that with the pandemic, we've certainly increased the
Yes.
amount of screen time, certainly in the educational realm. But all of us,
Yes.
you and I, are
Yes.
talking virtually today,
Exactly.
whereas historically we may have either talked by phone or had a face-to-face meeting. So we
Exactly.
are probably all increasing our screen time. What are some of the implications or downside associated with using screen time? And I don't know where the healthy limit is, and that may be age dependent, but
Yeah, that's a great
I can
question.
imagine there's a lot of different implications.
Yes, absolutely. And I definitely don't believe in the fear mongering because I don't think people change their behavior just because they're frightened into doing so. And so I find that education
At least
and
momentarily they
empathy.
might, but that
Yes,
usually
but
doesn't last, right?
that's exactly the point, right? Like we
Right.
even when we do this with our kids and we say like if you don't do this, then you lose screen time. Well, it works in the short term, but what are we setting them up for in the long term? And I think anybody who's a parent or works with kids knows that we have to take the long view, right? It's the little moments that are going to add up. And so yeah, I mean, I do think there is some serious potential risks and harms, and I really believe in using data to establish what those are. It's funny that Pew Research recently found the top three parenting fears in America are kidnapping. No, number one is youth mental health, then bullying, and then kidnapping. But what's fascinating to me is kidnapping is really statistically quite rare, and a lot of parents will say, "Oh, I got my kid a phone so I can protect them, so they can be safe. What if they get kidnapped?" Well, again, statistically super rare, but by giving kids unlimited access to the internet at a young age before their brains are fully developed, what do? We increase number one and number two, which is bullying and mental health. So it's sort of this tricky thing. We use a tool to address a solution to a problem that's not as big, but it's partly because of our own consumption of media. We're thinking that the world is a scarier, more dangerous place than it is. So yeah, it's pretty pervasive and cyclical, and I am still an optimist that there are things we can do.
So, does all of that, or at least the guidelines for healthy use of screen time, and I assume we're talking about screen time across all mediums, right?
Yes, that's a good point.
It's wonderful that your adolescent has a mobile device, but they may also be using a computer all day. To
Yeah,
your point,
yeah,
they're perhaps using electronic blackboards. Good old chalk and
yeah,
blackboards are gone by the way of
yep,
don't dodo
Yep.
bird, but also when they get home and maybe watching
Yeah,
television or other forms of screen time. So are there
exactly.
guidelines that have been established in terms of, safe usage, or at least,
Yeah.
guidelines around time in front of a screen?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked all the time. And I will say unhelpfully that a little bit is okay and a lot is too much. And it really depends on the kid, the age, the quantity, the development stage. And to your point, the screen time itself, right? It's one thing to FaceTime with grandma. It's quite another to consume TikTok videos for hours on end in terms of how that interacts with our brain, in terms of who we're relating to or not. So the AAP and the WHO do put some limits, usually around about a 2 hour mark. And I will say, like, for some kids, that doesn't, and that's for younger children, I think below 6, but it really, really, really depends, especially if you have more than one kid, that what works for one kid isn't going to work for the other. And so I always say to parents, the two most important questions you can ask, it's not how much screen time is too much and what parental controls do you recommend. It's, do I know what my kid is doing online? And do I have a good relationship with my kid? Because those are the things that are going to set them up for, success and mental health, future proofing their mental health. And so knowing the answer to those questions is actually more important in my mind than the total number of hours.
So how do parents get around, and I know there's a lot of tools out there to sort of restrict access and things of that
Yeah.
nature. But how do parents get around sort of that trust factor and
Yeah.
having those conversations with your kid and not having to track everything that they're doing? It's a
Yeah.
fascinating challenge. And, in my own case with grown children, adult children,
Yep.
I see when, the agreement was to provide cell phones when they were back in middle school or high school, whatever
Yep.
that was. And they said, okay, but
Yeah.
here's the caveat. We provide the phone. We get to see where you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny because my kids now in their mid and 20s, we still track where they are, but it's more out of our own comfort. It's not,
Yeah.
what are you doing here? It's like, hey, I haven't heard from you in 3 days. I'm glad you're on the move.
Right.
That type of
And
thing.
I would imagine you've told them you're doing this. So it's not like surveillance that you're
Absolutely.
not. Right. So
Yeah.
that's a big, big difference. The other thing is we're talking, you mentioned middle school and high school. We're 20% of 8-year-olds have iPhones now. So we're
Wow.
talking elementary schools are facing issues with kids bringing devices to school. And of course, the smart watch has become sort of people will say, oh, my kid doesn't have a phone, but they have a smartwatch, which in my mind is actually more distracting because it's on the body. It's completely something that kids are going to be drawn to. I don't think it's a better alternative. But
Funny
yeah,
you mentioned it.
it's
I witnessed a 6-year-old standing on a sidewalk yesterday playing with their smartwatch,
yes,
totally oblivious
yes.
to their surroundings. And my first thought was, well, is that safe? You
Exactly.
know,
So that's it. It's
know
the
your
paradox of
surroundings,
like,
know your environment, right?
exactly. So look, I get it. As a parent, I have a almost 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. I would love to know where they are at all times. On the other hand, what I also want them to do is build trust for themselves and in their surroundings and in the people that they're hanging out with. And so part of this is, I always say to parents, like, it's skills before screens, right? Like, do kids know your own phone number? Do they know the phone number by heart? No kid today is going to be
Who
able to
knows the
rattle
phone
off.
number? Right.
Anyone in a certain generation like me and perhaps you will know that we do know phone numbers from our childhood by heart because we had no alternative. You had to memorize them. And
Absolutely.
again, we talk about phones as being a convenience, right? Making our lives easier. But I actually would push back on that for children, especially. They need friction, they need tension, and they need to problem solve. And when we give them the phone to eliminate that doesn't make their learning happen, right? Friction is where the learning occurs. And so I would argue that kids are better off learning these skills first. And it's hard when they're going to feel like I'm the only one. But there are flip phones out there still that are available, right? Like, you can go old school. You don't need to buy the ones with the fancy bells and whistles if really what you need is a communication device. So that's kind of where we are. My 12-year-old doesn't have her own phone yet. We actually share my phone. It's been very interesting. So that's a strategy that doesn't work for everyone, but has been a learning experience for us.
Well, it's an interesting approach because I think so much of what
Yeah,
we see today and so much of what parents experience is driven by, dare I say, peer pressure. And, the
totally.
pressure of kids, all my friends, that's the classic line you
Exactly.
hear.
But
And
we
so
heard it too. Yeah. Yep.
yeah, but
Exactly.
parents
When
need to
we were
push
kids,
back
we said it.
because if we don't set
Exactly.
boundaries for our kids early, then they will never have boundaries.
Yeah. I agree. And it's going to take some courageous parents to sort of buck this trend. But I do think the pendulum is swinging back in that direction. And I think there's going to be a point where we look back and go, can you believe we gave 8-year-olds iPhones to go to school? Like, what were we thinking? That's my hope, because I just think it needs to.
Now, is it only about the let's call it the access to the world and the use of technology? I
Yeah.
often wonder myself about screen time, and there's been studies, and one of my children who spends an awful lot of time in front of a screen, I'm talking 15 to 18 hours a day, is now gone with anti-glare glasses and things of that nature. Are we
Right.
finding out that these things are damaging children's eyesight early, or and
Yeah.
perhaps their reactions to other types of things desensitizing them in some way?
Yeah, and this is, I will say, like, there's every time a new technology comes out, people freak out and say it's going to ruin everything. We were ratting our brains when we watched TV as a kid, that kind of thing. What's different today is the amount of access we have, right? The quantity, how many hours a day we're using it, and the younger and younger ages, right? Even television in the olden days was like one TV set in a common area in the house. Now we're walking around with televisions in our pocket, essentially, right? The accessibility is so much greater. Yes, in myopia, which is permanent nearsightedness, rates of that have increased significantly in the last 50 years, attributable probably to near work, which could include screens and computers. But we also know, again, that children's brains aren't adult brains. And we are now seeing the effects of some of this excessive screen use in early childhood. And there are impacts on language and development, eye health, physical health. You think about posture, how many teenagers you see walking around with like slumped shoulders. I mean, all of these things have long-term effects on health. But of course, children don't think about, oh, when they don't want to wear sunscreen so they don't get skin cancer when they're 60. They're not thinking that long term. So as
Sure.
parents, we have to help them advocate. And I do want to touch on, you mentioned the word trust, which I think is really important. Parents will say, well, I want to trust my kid. And I always say to parents, you can trust your child, but you cannot trust the internet. Nothing on the internet is going to be something you can rely on 100% as to protect and keep your kid's best interest at heart. And so there becomes that teaching moment where we have to talk to the kids about it. Why is it so hard to put it down? Why do you feel compelled to stay? Why is it so, manipulative in the way it keeps you hooked and holds your attention? And that is important for kids to understand, that because they're still learning and developing.
No, it's really fascinating. To your point, I think we as adults, I've seen many people who are challenged to put away their story or their feed or what have you. Oh, I just need to get
Yes.
through this, and
Yes.
so really fascinating to see that. If you don't have great role models, there's challenges, right?
Exactly.
So, fascinating.
Exactly.
Really fascinating stuff, Emily Cherkin. This is,
Thank
it's
you.
it's great insight. And if people want to reach out to you, Emily Cherkin, founder of the Screentime Consultant, they want to talk to you about your work or having challenges in their own families. What's the best way for them to reach you?
Well, I do have a website. It's the screentimeconsultant.com, but I also just wrote a book called The Screentime Solution, a judgment-free guide to becoming a tech intentional family, that's available on Amazon and anywhere books are sold. And I'm also on social media, which I realize the irony there, but I am there and I try to post content that's helpful to parents. So
Uh,
I welcome questions, and I'm always happy to chat with parents. So thank you.
a fascinating topic, and we can probably go on for hours. Wish you success with the launch of the book, and it's been a pleasure having you on Radio Entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Jonathan. Be well.
Our guest has been Emily Cherkin, founder of the Screentime Consultant, and we'll be back with another segment on Radio Entrepreneurs.